Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. This week, we're focusing on generative artificial intelligence, a technology with potentially transformative power in any number of industries. In this week's programme, we'll explore the scope of that potential. We'll ask how far-reaching the impact, beyond merely tech, might be, especially given that use cases continue to be defined. We'll sum up what entrepreneurs across sectors need to keep in mind and consider why culture could be a key determinant in establishing who captures value from the Gen AI transition. Here to discuss all those compelling themes with us today is Achille Monnet, who contributes towards global AI positioning within the CIO in UBS Global Wealth Management. Achille, welcome back to the show. Now, before we get into the detail of the report, give us a sense from you and your colleagues' standpoint of exactly what the transformational potential of generative AI is. I know that's kind of it's pretty macro, but give us that overview first of all before we talk about the report.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great question. And I think if we take it from a very high level, we take a step back from the details, what generative AI is fundamentally doing is it's fundamentally bringing down the marginal cost of intelligence. And that's quite a profound concept. You know, every time we have an algorithmic efficiency gain, something like a DeepSeek, for instance, what we've effectively done is bring down the cost of intelligence. And intelligence is an iffy concept, but I think we could all agree that there is wide applicability and wide monetization. And that's the other element of Gen AI. Not only is it very performant, but it's very ubiquitously applicable. It dominates the world of bits, and it can improve pretty much any digital workflow once the technology is more mature and cheaper to run, essentially, which will in turn allow it to proliferate. But at its core, what we're doing is we're bringing down the marginal cost of intelligence. If I take another quick analogy, if we compare that to the internet brought down the marginal cost of distribution. It connected all of us together, and that's why it's a network. This is more of a tool, and it's a tool that we use on a case-by-case basis, and essentially it can be viewed as a new computer. And that's why we think it's very much a paradigm shift, because we have to re-platform the entire software industrial complex, and of course all of the businesses that are built upon that, and it should end up being pretty impactful and pretty disruptive, and in turn create a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs and incumbents alike, of course.
Well, this is it. And it's entrepreneurs across sectors, which we'll come to in a minute. But just on that point about the potential, you know, we must be explicit of how much beyond tech as a sector alone it goes. Exactly how far reaching will this transformational impact be? Because I guess we continue to see use cases being defined and demonstrated. Does that is that what we need to see? More use cases which then show precisely how far beyond tech actually these technologies will make a significant impact?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like, I'm not an economist, but if we take a high level perspective, once again, there's about 1 billion knowledge workers globally. And you can think about the productivity benefits. Now, different industry participants have very punchy numbers out there talking about productivity benefits in coding, for instance, of 30 to 50%. Even if the reality is closer to 5 to 10, which is probably what it is right now, that's still a very, very profound step function change. And then, of course, you iterate on that technology from there. And that's the thing you have to keep in mind. The current versions of these models are the worst that they will ever be right now. And that is the nature of technology. That's something that's also unique to AI, is that it's improving. You know, if I use the internet once again, the internet is no longer improving. And that's what keeps us confidence in the sustainability of this trend, because each time you have a step function improvement in the capabilities and, of course, a step decrease in the cost, you create another avenue and another market for that Gen AI model. And I agree with you, it's always difficult to think about the use cases. And in some cases, in some situations, my job is like that of an internet analyst in 1995, trying to predict the brave new world that will be in front of us. And so we think it's much easier to focus on the underlying characteristics of the technology, which once again are that it's very performant, very ubiquitously applicable, and improving at a drastic rate, and to take comfort that that will prove to be monetizable. And of course, we have a lot of data points nowadays that show that the stepping stone to more monetization is clearly there. There I would highlight domains like coding, customer care, and digital advertising, of course. So I think the technology is developing in an encouraging way. and the monetization will follow through from that. And the monetization potential is just based off the massive amount of knowledge work that we do globally, which can be augmented essentially everywhere by a smart, capable, above intern and soon to be executive level like intelligence assistants in your pocket with you at all times.
Well, let's talk about what this means then for entrepreneurs, because I guess one of the things that maybe is a little scary about some of the trends that you've talked about there is the very pace you've described. So how do entrepreneurs capture that? Because I guess there may be a risk, look, I can't be the master of my sector because I'm being outperformed by the pace of this technological transition. So what do entrepreneurs, regardless of sector, need to keep in mind?
Yeah. So I think one of the beauties of AI and one of the things that's maybe a little bit misunderstood is that so far it's not been very disruptive. I think we would all agree. Microsoft's been here for the last 45 years. It's not exactly a new kid on the block. Same thing with NVIDIA, Google, Meta, Amazon, and the long list of large incumbents that have captured AI so far. And I think what you have to keep in mind is that AI is unlikely to be disruptive on the development side, because it's an expensive technology to build. And that's, of course, linked to the scaling laws. But when it comes to the actual implementation of AI, this is where startups have an advantage and can create new markets, because there's going to be fundamentally new use cases. And on top of that, the big benefit that entrepreneurs and startups have is that AI is new for everyone. And because it's new for everyone, enterprises and consumers alike are willing to test and experiment. If you compare that to the software industrial complex, every enterprise in the world knows where they have to go to get the best network security products, for instance, or where they have to go to get the best ERP product. But the battlegrounds are not as defined in the Gen AI transition. And that's what gives entrepreneurs a decent opportunity to try and build a wedge and turn that into a business. And we're seeing that in some of the areas that I highlighted already, particularly in the coding domain, which has been the first big scaled sort of killer application of Gen AI. And in the coding domain, even though GitHub Copilot has been a very successful product, you've seen that the market has not been saturated by the existing incumbents in the industry. And companies like Cursor or Windsurf have been able to grow pretty sizable businesses quite quickly because of that speed of iteration, that counter positioning advantage of not having the legacy infrastructure, and the willingness of enterprises, workers, and consumers alike, of course, to experiment and eventually even scale up some of these projects. So the battlegrounds are not fair because existing incumbents have the distribution and entrenchment advantage. But I would say that it's never been easier to be a startup than right now.
Well, just before we delve into some sector by sector considerations, I just want to pick up on one thing which really jumped out at me. I think it's right in the introduction, actually, at the top of the report, talking about culture being this key determinant. If we're looking at which firms will genuinely and generally capture the value from Gen AI rather than be disrupted. What do you mean when you use culture in that context, Achille? Is it about that capacity to be nimble? Is it about that legacy in the space? What do you mean when you use culture in that context?
Well, you have to keep in mind that we're in a very fast evolving world, and Gen AI is a completely new paradigm that itself is improving at a dramatic rate. And so culture is going to be very important for keeping up with those disruptive forces, for repositioning your business models. If we take the software industry once again as an example, there's a lot of fundamental changes in software, right? So, I mean, the simplest one that comes to mind is we're moving from seats-based pricing, individual user-based pricing, to potentially AI agents. And there it's more about consumption and value propositions and value add. And so culture helps manage these transitions. And I think in the face of that uncertainty and that disruption, it should be a key driver for those successful businesses versus the less successful businesses. And I think with Gen AI, I think you want to lead from the front. And I don't think there's going to be a tremendous amount of time if you're not leading from the front to catch up. And if we compare that with the cloud transition, even though it's always costly to not make the cloud transition as soon as possible for software businesses, once again, it hasn't been a death blow for some of the slow movers because of that entrenchment and that switching costs that they have with their client base. But with Gen AI, I would suspect and we believe that it's more likely to be the case that if you're a slow mover, you're going to have a tougher time to catch up, and it's going to be less forgiving in that sense. So I think culture is a very important dynamic for driving that constant iteration, that constant improvement, and of course, greater and greater monetization potential over time.
Now, in the reports, Achille, it's really interesting. I think there are sort of, 10 to 12 different sectors, and it's broken down on a sort of case by case, which makes really interesting reading. Maybe let's just kind of jump into a couple of those, just by way of demonstrating sort of how you've applied some of this out of the abstract and then into these sector specifics. I mean, healthcare is a good one. It's been a big narrative, hasn't it? You know, the transformational impact of Gen AI on drug discovery, for example. But maybe just as healthcare, walk us through that one and tell us why and how these advantages and opportunities that you've already been talking about can be brought into laser focus on that sector specifically.
Sure. So maybe I premise this by saying I'm not a healthcare expert, but as far as I've understood it, the time to bring a drug to market is 8+ years and $2 to $3 billion. And you can think about all the various different steps in the process from going from a molecule to full phase 3 trials. There's a tremendous amount of R&D, iteration, and innovation that needs to go. And when we talk about applying Gen AI and applying Gen AI specifically to drug discovery and aspects like protein structures and human genome sequencing, these are all areas where we had pretty limited knowledge beforehand. And Gen AI is allowing us to understand molecules and genomes and DNA at a much more profound level. So I think it's a question of the scope for R&D is so massive in healthcare. The process right now is pretty drawn out and challenging. That does, of course, bring its own challenges in place in that you do have to deal with very stringent regulation. And so AI is more likely to be an assistant for a very long time with humans in the loop for a very long time in healthcare than maybe in another domain like customer care, for instance, where the downside is not as dramatic. But we think there's going to be a lot of applicability in healthcare, particularly on the cost side. It remains to be seen whether it's going to be a revenue generator. And given it's a cost-driven innovation, we think the largest incumbents with the biggest R&Ds and the more defensive moats should be better positioned to monetize Gen AI as they have a bigger potential to bring Gen AI to their R&D budgets. And they typically have better competitive positioning, which should allow them to retain some of that cost efficiency benefit that it creates. So I think healthcare, I think emerging material science, I think those kind of very forward-looking scientific R&D areas, there is no ceiling to, so to speak, with regards to the potential that Gen AI can bring, because it can bring emerging knowledge, emerging R&D, and emerging innovation that didn't exist beforehand. And that's why a lot of people are very excited about this space. And of course, just having a deeper understanding of the human body and how all of us on a global basis operate should prove to be very valuable. And it's a naturally high curiosity space, of course.
Absolutely. Another thing that strikes me as interesting, you sort of alluded earlier to the high capex initially, or certainly for the time being, at kind of deep investment in this space. And I guess that speaks to another of the costs of this Gen AI progression, which is power demand, right? Grid demand, data centers, that we know there are broader questions about sustainability and how much that can be driven by renewables and so forth. But again, the report makes an interesting point that actually, if we zoom out and think about what's the big picture for utilities, there's an exciting challenge and opportunity here in this space. It's another good example, right?
For sure. And if I give you some statistics, if you listen to the ARM CEO, he talks about how data centers in the US represent about 3 to 4% of the total electricity consumption today. And they expect that to go to 20 to 25% by the end of the decade. And energy is a real bottleneck right now. It's not so much the capacity for energy that we're lacking. There is a problem in terms of capacity for energy, but we're not hitting that wall just yet. The real challenge is the location of energy and finding energy near viable plots of land to build these data centers. And of course, the data centers themselves are scaling up quite dramatically, right? We're talking about building 5 gigawatt data center campuses now. And for context, 5 gigawatt, I believe, is bigger than any city's consumption in the world. So a very significant amount of power draw. And that is a big component of costs, ultimately. And we need to drive up the energy efficiency per task and drive down the energy intensity per task so we can use more AI. And that's the thing about technology generally, is we're always trying to drive down the cost per task or the cost per technology, just so we can take advantage of the elasticity of the demand curve and drive demand much higher. That's, of course, the story of semiconductors at Moore's law. over the last 60 years. It's, of course, also the story in terms of mobile data consumption and fixed broadband consumption. And those have two very different dynamics. If you think about semis, tremendous market value add for the businesses powering that trend. You think about the Intels of this world, the Samsungs, the TSMCs, whereas telcos and mobile demand, even though there's a lot of growth, hasn't been a great place for your money. And that's, of course, based off the competitive positioning of the different firms. So growth will be there. And the question as to who captures that growth and who retains the value ultimately will come down to the competitive positioning of the different industries. But of course, energy is going to be one of the biggest beneficiary sectors. And it's one of the fundamental building blocks of Gen AI. So we cannot have Gen AI without energy.
Achille Jean Monnet, bringing us to the end of this edition of the programme here on Monocle Radio. You can listen again and explore more at monocle.com, or discover more and find out how UBS can help you at ubs.com. This is The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.